Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program today, Assemblyman Mike Norris. Mike Norris represents the 144th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes Niagara, Orleans, and Erie counties. And we want to thank you folks for joining us for our program today. Assemblyman Norris, it is nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Mike. Thank you for having me on the show today.
And look at that, you survived your first budget negotiations here at the state capitol in Albany, and you're here to tell the tale.
Yes, I am.
How about that, huh? Well, I got a lot of questions for you for a first-time member looking at this budget process, how it all came together, and the negotiations itself. And we'll, of course, be talking about the impact of the budget on the folks you represent across Western New York. But you made it. And I suppose that's got to be victory number one.
It is a victory number one. I'm just glad that it's over with. It was a very tenuous process to get through. We were here 13 nights straight, but the good news is we have a budget, and the people back home can take solace in the fact that we got our job done.
Excellent. Now let's talk a little bit about how you got the job done, because your first time through it, was it what you expected it to be?
I got to tell you, at some points it was very frustrating. The budget process here in New York really came down to 4 people in a room. The leaders of the Speaker of the Assembly, the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate IDC Chairman, as well as the Governor. And they get into a room and they try to hammer out the details, and oftentimes the rank and file members are quite frankly left out of the process. And I think we need to do more about including the rank and file members in the process to make sure the people back home's voices are heard. For example, when there was finally a budget deal, it was announced around Friday at 9 o'clock, and it was the big ugly, they call it. This budget, they throw a lot of policy in there, which quite frankly, I think policy should be outside of the budget. It should be debated on its own merits and vetted thoroughly by the legislature instead of going into the budget. But in this big ugly policy, like for example, raise the age was in there, workers' compensation, Uber, a lot of the big policy items were in there. But I got that bill, I got the announcement about 9 o'clock, and then about 6 o'clock in the morning, where I received a budget memo, and we were voting on this very large budget bill right away, and debated only until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That process needs to be reformed, it needs to be changed, and I want to be a strong advocate in doing that and working for more transparency. On the overall budget itself, though, there were some good things and there were many bad things. And I look at it as an overall approach at the size of the budget, $163.2 billion. Now, Mike, when I go to the grocery store or I go to the local department store, I take my credit card there and I have to determine what I need and what I want. And ultimately it comes down to what I need and the priorities that are important to what I need for my household. The same theory should be used for the overall state budget. For example, there is $10 billion in backdoor borrowing in this budget with no approval by the voters. We just borrowed it, and there is no plan to actually pay for this debt.
In the state constitution, it says that any borrowing by the state of New York is supposed to be approved by the people. The people are supposed to have a say as to whether or not the project that's being proposed or that's up on the table for discussion you should go into debt for, to finance. You know, maybe, you know, if you buy a house or you're going to do renovations to your house, you might consider borrowing to get that kind of work done. But so it's pretty much the same thing as you've been drawing your analogy, the same thing for the state of New York. If you've got a big enough project and you need to borrow for it, it should be the people who are going to have to pay it back who are going to decide whether or not it's a worthwhile project, right? And that hasn't been happening.
It has not been happening here. We asked many questions about that on the floor, and they just say, well, we need to borrow these funds. Well, $10 billion in addition to the other over $50 billion of existing debt that we already have. You know, eventually, you even see this at the federal level, you know, $19, $20 trillion in debt at the federal government. We need to rein in the spending, we need to rein in our debt, and we need to make sure that we provide for a budget which would pay these things down sooner than later. So I don't want to put this debt on the backs of the taxpayers anymore, the grandchildren, our future generations, and I think that's a real problem. On top of that, there was $7 billion increase of spending in taxes and fees in this budget that are in there. And I've got a real concern about more taxation. I mean, the population, particularly in Western New York, continues to go south. Why is that? Property taxes, income taxes. We are taxed way too much in New York State. This is a fact, and people are moving with their feet to the south where taxes and government are less in size. So I think overall, as a principle, this budget has way too much spending. It has way too much taxes. When I'm going through my district and talking to folks back home, we talk about this. We talk about it at the volunteer fire companies. I visited them over the weekend for recruitny.org, and I thank the volunteer firemen and everyone who's supporting that. But when I'm out there talking to folks, they're saying, we can't afford this anymore, Mike. We need people to stand up and say enough is enough. So I was proud to say that I did vote against the overall budget, the big ugly bill, because spending and taxes are way too high, and I added my voice to that.
It I would think it would give you some perspective to be thinking about, well, all right, so if it was me, if I was the king of New York and it was all up to me to decide what to do, what I would fund and what I would not fund and what the role of state government is. I mean, you've got the federal government above, you've got all the municipalities, the towns and cities and villages below. What's the role of state government and what should we be spending all our money on? And maybe we could be spending less, and that gets us into probably the next part of our discussion, which is the content of this budget. You heard a lot from the governor about big grand ideas like free college tuition for certain members of the New York State community. That's a very, it's not free. It's not free, right? No. I mean, somebody's got to pay the bill.
Someone's got to pay for it, and the taxpayers are going to end up paying for it. And that's the point. In theory, it sounds like a great idea. We send everyone to college. I went to college. I understand, being from a middle-class family, the importance of going to college. But at the same time, you have to look and examine how we're going to pay for this. And that was a real concern with the college tuition, as well with private colleges. There are private colleges in New York State. There are many around the Western New York area, like Niagara University, Canisius, Duval, and others, where that was also a factor. So when I'm talking to the folks back home, they're like, Mike, in theory it sounds great, but we know someone has to pay for it. The initial cost for 1 year is $163 million, and that's for the tuition. Doesn't include obviously the room and board, and there's an income level on that. I have other folks who say to me, why isn't everyone receiving free education? Why is there an income level? Well, that's a good question. We provide education pre-K through 12th grade. Anyone can go. There was another something that someone brought up to me. So when you really look at the details and you examine it, it all comes down to dollars. It all comes down to priorities. Now, I also want to just say, for the Western New York delegation, it was very, very important for us to fight for things back home in the budget. The budget is very massive. It is very big. We've talked about this on the show. And we wanted to make sure, by working in a bipartisan manner from Western New York, that we got our priorities in there. And I just want to touch on some of those. And from day one, we were fighting for that. We were sending letters and adding our voice. Library funding, we were able to restore library funding for back home. We were able to fight for Uber, and we got ride sharing up for upstate New York, which has been very important to me and the other members of the Western New York delegation. I don't like the 4% tax on that, but we do have ride sharing. And so you look at these priorities, CHIPS funding, for example, for our roads and for our infrastructure. I heard from all the highway superintendents and how our roads are deteriorating and we need to get them fixed. I'm proud to say that working together in a bipartisan manner, even with the governor on those matters, we were able to restore the existing CHIPS and add some winter recovery funds for our roads, and also an investment of $2.5 billion in infrastructure. Now, that's something that I support, because it comes down to priorities. And I believe the role of our state government is to make sure that we protect our infrastructure and we provide a gateway to making sure we can have our transportation and our commerce here. So that was a positive thing. So though there are some negative things, many negative things in this budget, there were some positive things, and I'm proud to say, working together in Western New York, we were able to get some of these things done.
How about that big program for Western New York, the one that gets everybody's attention, the big Buffalo Billions project? Apparently, there's more money in this budget being put towards the Buffalo Billions?
Yes, there's a $400 million investment. Again, this is very positive for the Western New York region. I applaud Governor Cuomo and his efforts there, along with the delegation. This investment is helping downtown Buffalo, Erie, and Niagara counties. I will just say two things on that. I'm very proud that we were able to get those funds, but we need to have proper oversight for the contracts that are being led in those areas. We need to make sure we have proper oversight in the process. And so I just caution the governor and others back home to make sure we provide for that during this process. But overall, I'm very proud to say we were able to work together in a bipartisan manner to do this, to bring it back home, and things are working. On the other side of things, I want to just point out, though, we are putting $1.4 billion in there, and I just encourage the governor and the Empire State Development to continue to help companies like Akron Rural, who just received a $1.5 billion investment in my district, and to retool our existing companies as well. I talked to many folks throughout the area, the businesses, and they also need help to be retooled and right-sized as we go forward. And I commend the governor for the investment in Akron Rural, but I also want to make sure that we look to providing investment in other companies as well.
Yeah, there are, certain spending seems like a no-brainer almost, like you have to take care. Again, comparing it to a homeowner or to an individual family, there's certain expenses that one has to make. You have to keep up the house, you have to keep up your property, you have to pay your bills, things like that. But at one point during the budget negotiations, I remember the governor saying how concerned he was about what kind of aid the state would be receiving from the federal government because of their own budget talks that they're having in Washington, D.C., and how we may not know till October, and oh no, what's Albany going to do? Well, you would think if he was concerned, kind of like if the homeowner or the family was concerned about, well, maybe the market that my employment is in isn't doing so well, maybe I need to be concerned about whether I might get laid off or something like that. We should live within our means and not overspend. That maybe the state of New York should maybe consider that same kind of mindset. Would that not make sense in a perfect world?
I think it would make sense in a perfect world. And the governor was very important for some of this consolidation of local governments. And I believe that we should always strive to have the most efficient and the effective government. I will say a lot of my local municipalities back home in my district have been doing this for a long time. Why are we not examining right-sizing the agencies of the state government, looking at proper Medicaid spending, doing more studying of these types of areas into our massive budget? I think there's a lot of fat in that budget, a lot of things that can be right-sized, and I'm going to continue to work very hard to make sure we bring effective state government to the people of New York.
We're down to about our last minute here. I understand there was one kind of major disappointment, and that might have an impact again, will have an impact on the folks that are watching this program. No putting back of the STAR rebate program like it used to be, that it was just a credit that came off your taxes and it was an easy thing for people to get that savings, but that it's going to continue now as a rebate program, even though there had been a lot of talk that, well, that wasn't really working out so good, we'll put it back the other way.
I tell you, in my office, that is the number one concern that people are calling. They still haven't gotten their rebate check. That's been a real problem. If you need assistance with that, please call my district office at 839-4691 and let us know. We can help you with that. The Assembly passed a bill unanimously to go back to the old system. Unfortunately, in the budget, that did not happen. And I just want to also just say that the Lakeshore, Southern Lakeshore in Niagara County is being heavily impacted. Right. I'm working very hard with the emergency personnel. We are being very, very critical of International Joint Commission, and I want to make sure I remind the residents back home to please document any damage, because if we are successful in getting state and federal aid, we will be able to help you through that process. So please document it, and I am fighting very hard for you and to make sure we protect that shoreline. And
that is all the time we have for today. Assemblyman Mike Norris, thanks for joining us so much. Thank you folks too for spending your time. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.